And how do you think the passage of the 21st Century Cures Act or the upcoming PDUFA 6 and the new tone in Washington will impact the pathway for rare disease drug?
Yeah, well, I think in some ways, Sarepta asking for accelerated approval beginning back in 2012, 2013, kind of set the stage for where is that comfort level, right? And how ready is the agency to embrace this? I think we hear a lot at the high level and at a Congress that we need to consider patient input, we need to consider real world evidence, we need to consider patient reported outcomes. But the divisions that are actually looking at the clinical trial data, they're not always in step, as we saw from what came out around Sarepta, always in step with the hierarchy and the policy positions. And so I think, though, this trend, though, is continuing. We see it not just with Fidesia, where it started, 21st Century Cures, PDUFA 6 will likely continue this march toward more patient input, more real-world evidence, patient-reported outcomes incorporated, and finding ways to allow therapies that are safe and have some evidence, right, that they're doing something for the patient to get out there more quickly. Now, that doesn't mean we should see standards lowering, but it means that there needs to be a meeting halfway, if you will, of industry that is trying to do everything they can to characterize their technology when there's patients who desperately want these medications.
So do you consider that Sarepta's approach was a pioneering one in terms of how other biotechs are also approaching interactions with the FDA?
Yeah, it clearly became emblematic of different opinions across the industry and within the agency even. And so, in many ways, while we didn't plan to be the first to request accelerated approval after Fidesia, we were the first company on the backs of that legislation to say, okay, maybe the FDA is ready to approve this. And clearly we saw the pains of that type of change ensue over the next several years. But I do think, it's like the first one that tries to run through that wall will get hurt the most, but they're leaving an opening for others to come through. And we see this even with some recent guidance from the FDA around an SMA drug being developed by Advocacy. Okay, the FDA apparently gave them guidance that not only can they have an open label 30-patient study as their pivotal, but their 12-patient study open label that the FDA said, come talk to us when you have, I think, 2 years of data, and we'll consider talking to you about accelerated approval. So clearly they're looking for ways to do this. And I think the challenge with Sarepta and why it became such a controversial issue is that the data was not curative. It was not robust. It wasn't something people could debate how much that treatment effect was there or if it was there at all. Now, I believe we did show, not just on the dystrophin, but on other clinical outcomes. We looked at dystrophin protein several different ways, immunofluorescence. We looked at the mechanism through RT-PCR. We really were trying to work with the FDA on the right protocols to assess that. And everybody focused on the lowest percentage of Western blot value. But when you look at it in its totality, I think there's sufficient evidence that it's an active drug and that it's conveying some benefit.
So tied to that context, I mean, Sarepta's drug approval continued to be a controversial subject and debate about whether the FDA has lowered their standards or made an exception approval due to patient pressure. Do you think the FDA lowered its standard, and do you think that the patient advocacy group from the Duchenne muscular dystrophy community was the critical influence for the FDA's decision?
Well, I think it's hard to separate what are all the factors that ultimately led to an approval. I think what we tried to focus on as a company was strictly the clinical data, okay? And never did I bring a patient advocate with me to an FDA meeting. We never showed videos of patients in our corporate presentations or in our case. In fact, it was the FDA that asked us to collect some patient-reported outcomes that we did through an independent means that ended up being presented at the advisory panel meeting in Washington. So I think we're in an era now where the patient voice is there across many diseases, and they're not going to go away, and they're going to demand more to hear their voice heard. And I think with DMD and Sarepta, and there were many DMD companies pursuing approval around this time, we saw their voice get louder and louder and louder. And so clearly the FDA was aware of that. In fact, there was almost a parallel process where the hierarchy was meeting with advocates independent of our efforts, while we were meeting with largely the division. But we had members of the hierarchy that would attend our meetings as well. So they were hearing not just from the company, but from the patient advocates, independent and in a parallel kind of process. And so clearly the decision was not made in a vacuum. I think the patients did an adequate job of highlighting this disease, highlighting the progressive nature of it, and highlighting the risk-benefit that they were willing to tolerate to accept a drug. And I hope that had an influence, because I think the FDA is saying they want to consider the patient input, and Congress is saying you should be considering the patient perspective. But was it in a complete vacuum? Was that the only reason they approved it? I doubt that, because there were two other companies pursuing approval for a DMD drug. One of them was rejected through a review process, and one of them got a refuse to file, wasn't even considered. So if the FDA was that easy to manipulate by patient advocates, I think we would have seen all of these drugs approved. And that's why I don't believe they lowered the standards, and they really focused on the science, which may not have been as robust as some other programs, but was sufficient to have the hierarchy at least say that this is worthy of approval.
If you want to hear more from Chris and other thought leaders in the orphan drug industry, make sure to join us on April 20th and 21st in Washington, D.C. at the World Orphan Drug Congress USA 2017. Thank you.